Grief is supposed to be a private room, a quiet space where you can honor a life that has ended. But my mother stood at the door to my father's and told me I wasn't on the list. The final chapter of his life was by invitation only, and my invitation had been rescinded by the gatekeeper herself. The phone call was clinical, her voice devoid of the warmth you'd expect from a grieving widow talking to her daughter. "Clara," Eleanor began, her tone already exhausted, as if my name alone was a burden. "I'm calling to let you know that the reading of your father's will is on Friday. It's for immediate family only." I was confused for a beat, my mind still foggy with loss. "Okay, Mom. What time?" I asked, ready to write it down. The silence on the other end was heavy, intentional. It was a silence designed to make me feel stupid for asking. "I don't think you should come," she said finally, the words clipped and sharp. "Given your difficult disposition lately, your presence would only cause a scene. We need to honor your father's memory with peace and dignity, not arguments." Difficult. There it was. The word she had branded me with since I was a teenager, the one she used any time I had an opinion that didn't mirror her own. I had been difficult for going to a college out of state. I was difficult for questioning her narrative. Now, I was too difficult to mourn my own father. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She was using my grief as a bargaining chip, my love for my dad as a weapon against me. The message was clear, my sorrow was inconvenient, my presence a liability to the perfect picture of a grieving family she intended to paint. I didn't argue. Arguing would only prove her point. It was a perfectly constructed trap. I just stood there in my silent apartment, the phone feeling cold against my ear, and felt a familiar, hollow ache spread through my chest. This was her final power play. My eyes landed on a framed photo on my bookshelf, me and my dad at a baseball game last summer. He was laughing, his arm slung around my shoulder. He had loved my difficult nature. He called it strength. My mother called it a problem to be managed. My hand instinctively went to the nightstand, my fingers brushing against the cool, worn leather of the journal he had given me for my 18th birthday. "For all your difficult thoughts," he'd written on the first page. "Never let anyone convince you to keep them quiet." Eleanor had hated it on sight. That journal was proof. It was the evidence of a relationship she could never control, a bond she could never break. And now she was trying to sever it retroactively, to edit me out of his final moments on Earth, to erase my name from the story. After the call, I tried my brother, Mark. His voice was laced with a pathetic, preemptive apology. "I know, Clara, it's not fair," he'd sighed. "But you know how Mom gets. It's just easier this way. Dad wouldn't want us to fight." He was wrong. Dad would have wanted me in that room. Mark's version of easier was just cowardice wrapped in a flimsy excuse. He was willing to trade my presence for his own comfort, to let our mother's narrative win because challenging it was too much work. His betrayal was quiet, but it was just as sharp. On the day of the reading, I sat in my apartment, the silence a suffocating blanket. I pictured the scene in the lawyer's office, Eleanor, clad in expensive black, a model of performative sorrow. Mark, sitting beside her, silent and obedient. The chair that should have been mine was empty. My absence was a testament to her victory. She had successfully quarantined the difficult daughter, ensuring the final narrative of Richard's life was hers, and hers alone, to control. I felt utterly powerless, a ghost barred from my own father's haunting. She hadn't just closed a door on me, she had locked it and convinced everyone else in the room that I was the one who had lost the key. The label of difficult was my mother's oldest and most effective weapon against me. She assigned it to me when I was 7, during a parent-teacher conference. My teacher had called me inquisitive. My mother heard argumentative. She came home and told my father, "Clara asks too many questions. It's unladylike." From that day on, our family had its roles clearly defined. My mother was the director, the unquestionable authority on all matters. My brother, Mark, learned quickly that his lines were simple: "Yes, Mom," and "Whatever you think is best, Mom." He played his part perfectly and was rewarded with praise for being so agreeable. I, on the other hand, could never stick to the script. It wasn't intentional defiance, not at first. It was just a fundamental inability to accept things without understanding them. I wanted to know why. Why couldn't we visit the Science Museum instead of another stuffy art gallery? Why did I have to wear a dress when my dad was just taking me to the park? My father, Richard, was my quiet co-conspirator in this. He never openly defied Eleanor, but he nurtured my curiosity in secret. He was the one who bought me the chemistry set she called messy, the one who listened to my theories about dinosaurs, the one who taught me how to debate an idea respectfully. He saw my mind as a garden to be cultivated. My mother saw it as a wilderness to be tamed. This created a fundamental rift in our family. My relationship with my dad was a private alliance, a safe space where my thoughts weren't a problem to be solved. Eleanor resented this deeply. She couldn't stand the idea of a bond she didn't orchestrate. She would constantly try to reframe our connection. "Don't bother your father with your silly questions, Clara," she'd say. Or after I'd had a long conversation with him, she'd remark to me, "You exhaust him with your constant need for attention." Mark became the golden child by default. He was easy. He was malleable. He never challenged her authority, so he was showered with affection and privileges. He was held up as the model child, the one who didn't cause any trouble. My brother was praised for his obedience. I was punished for my thoughts. This became the central truth of our childhood. He learned that conformity was currency in our home, while I learned that my own mind was a liability. The schism deepened when it was time for college. Eleanor had a local university all picked out for me, one close enough that I could live at home. It was a non-negotiable plan. My life was a blueprint she had drawn, and she would not tolerate any edits. But my father had been secretly helping me with applications to schools across the country. One night, he slipped me a check from his personal savings account. "For your escape fund," he whispered with a wink. "Don't let her dim your shine, Clara." When I was accepted to a university in California, Eleanor didn't speak to me for a month. She told the rest of the family that I was selfish, ungrateful, and abandoning them. In her eyes, my independence was the ultimate betrayal. During my father's illness in his final years, she used his fragility as her shield. She became the gatekeeper to his life, controlling who saw him and when. Every phone call was monitored, every visit supervised. "Don't bring up anything stressful," she would warn me before I went in to see him. "Your opinions agitate him." She effectively silenced me, turning my love for my father into a gag order. I had to be a smiling, agreeable doll, or I wouldn't be allowed to see him at all. So my exclusion from his will reading wasn't a new wound. It was the logical, brutal conclusion to a war she had been waging against me for decades. She had been trying to erase my influence, my bond with him, my very thoughts, for my entire life. In her mind, by barring me from that room, she was finally achieving her ultimate goal, a family, and a legacy, that was finally, completely, and quietly under her absolute control. In the fog of the days following my father's death, the red flags were like flares, impossible to ignore. My mother, Eleanor, moved through our grief not like a fellow mourner, but like a military general securing a new territory. Her mission was clear: control the narrative, control the legacy. I tried to involve myself in the funeral preparations, hoping we could find some common ground in our shared loss. I offered to help write the obituary, to put together a photo slideshow, to speak at the service. Each offer was met with a polite but firm wall. "Thank you, Clara, but it's all handled," she said, not looking up from her list of approved flower arrangements. "We want to ensure everything is tasteful and reflects who your father really was." The implication was that my version of him, my memories, were somehow illegitimate or untrustworthy. At the funeral, she was a masterful actress. She played the part of the stoic, devastated widow flawlessly, accepting condolences with a sort of tragic grace. But her performance had a secondary function: to completely isolate me. Whenever a distant relative or one of my father's old friends would approach me to share a memory, Eleanor would materialize at their elbow. "She's just so overwhelmed," she'd say with a sad smile, placing a proprietary hand on my arm. "It's best not to overwhelm her." She spoke for me, erased me, right in front of my face. The most jarring red flag came a few days after. I was in my father's home office, a room that had always been a sanctuary for me. I just wanted to sit in his chair, to feel close to him. I reached for a small, carved wooden bird on his desk, a trinket he'd had forever. "Don't touch that." Eleanor's voice was sharp, coming from the doorway. "Nothing is to be touched until the estate is properly assessed. Everything is now part of a legal process." She had transformed our family home into a cold museum, and she was the sole, unyielding curator. Her language shifted. She started using words like estate, assets, and executor. She spoke of my father's belongings not as memories, but as legal items to be distributed. Her grief seemed to have been replaced overnight by a chilling, corporate efficiency. I started hearing snippets of her phone calls, her voice low and conspiratorial. She'd be talking to her sister or a family friend, and I'd catch my name. "So emotional, you can't imagine. It's a very delicate situation. She's always been difficult, but this has amplified it tenfold." She was building her case against me, laying the groundwork for my eventual exile. She was painting a portrait of me as an unstable, hysterical daughter, a problem that needed to be managed for the good of the family. It was a lie, but it was a lie she was telling with such conviction that people were beginning to believe it. The final warning sign came from my brother. I found Mark in the kitchen one evening and asked him if he'd heard anything about the will or the lawyer, Mr. Davies. He immediately tensed up, busying himself by rinsing a coffee cup that was already clean. "I'm not sure," he mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. "Mom is handling all of that. She said it's complicated." His evasiveness was as good as a confession. He knew what was coming and lacked the courage to warn me. He was a co-conspirator in his silence. He had chosen his side. He would rather be a loyal soldier in our mother's army than a brother to me. That look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I knew then that my mother wasn't just planning to sideline me. She was planning to formally cut me out. The funeral was just the dress rehearsal. The main event was yet to come, and I was going to be the only one in the family left off the guest list. A cold dread settled in my stomach. She wasn't just mourning a husband, she was seizing an empire. And her first official act as queen was to banish the one person who would ever dare to question her reign. The official betrayal came, as I knew it would, not in person, but over the phone. An in-person conversation would have required my mother to look me in the eye, and her brand of cruelty always thrived at a safe distance. She called on a Tuesday, her voice as crisp and sterile as a legal document. Clara, I'm calling about the reading of the will, she began, without any preamble. I braced myself. It's this Friday at the lawyer's office. I wanted to let you know the arrangements. The way she said it felt rehearsed, like she was reading from a script she'd practiced. Okay, what time should I be there? The question was a test. I knew the answer before I'd even asked, but some small, foolish part of me hoped I was wrong. The pause that followed was her savoring the moment. Then, the axe fell. Actually, I've decided it's best if you don't attend, she stated, her voice unwavering. It's a private affair, for those of us who can handle it with the solemnity it deserves. Your presence would be a distraction. The humiliation was a physical sensation, a hot flush that crawled up my neck. She wasn't just barring me, she was judging my grief and finding it unworthy. She was curating my father's memory, and I was a piece of art she had deemed too ugly to display. I found my voice, though it was shaking. He was my father, Mom. I have a right to be there. A right to hear his last words. The word right sounded hollow as soon as I said it. Rights didn't exist in my mother's kingdom, only privileges she could grant or revoke. Her reply was swift and cutting. A right? Don't be so dramatic, Clara. Your father's memory deserves peace, not your difficult theatrics. My decision is final. It was the verbal equivalent of a door being slammed and bolted in my face. The conversation was over. She had won. My hand was shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone. The call ended, and the silence that rushed in was filled with her victory. She had done it. She had legally, officially, and with the full force of her matriarchal power, made me an orphan twice over. In a desperate, last-ditch effort, I called my brother, Mark. I prayed he would have a spine, that he would be outraged on my behalf. The plea died in my throat as soon as I heard his weary sigh. She already told me her decision, he said. And you're just going to let her do it? I asked, my voice cracking. Mark, this is Dad's will. She can't just ban me from it. The desperation in my own voice was a fresh wave of humiliation. Clara, just let it go, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if he was afraid she might overhear him from miles away. You know how she gets. It's not worth the fight. Dad would have wanted peace. He was using my father's memory as a shield for his own cowardice. That was the deepest betrayal. Not just that he wouldn't fight for me, but that he would twist our father's intentions to justify it. My dad never shied away from a fight for what was right. He had taught me to be this way. And now his own son was using a false version of him to enforce my mother's tyranny. I hung up the phone. There were no more allies. No more avenues of appeal. I was completely and utterly alone in this, cast out by the two people who were supposed to be my family. The humiliation was absolute. It wasn't just that I was being excluded from a legal proceeding. It was a public declaration to the world, or at least to the world that mattered, that I was not a legitimate part of this family. I was the difficult daughter, the emotional mess, the one who wasn't fit to sit in the same room as the proper, grieving family members. My mother had finally succeeded in creating the family she always wanted, a queen and her loyal, obedient prince. And I was the madwoman she had finally, triumphantly, locked away in the tower. On Friday, the world kept moving, but my life stood still. I watched the clock on my wall, each tick a countdown to my own erasure. 10 a.m. The meeting would be starting now. I imagined them walking into Mr. Davies' polished office, a united front of grief, leaving me behind like a forgotten piece of luggage. The silence in my apartment was a physical presence. It was the sound of my own worthlessness, the sound of an empty chair in a room miles away. I sank onto my sofa, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. My mind became a torture chamber, replaying scenes that weren't even real. I pictured Mr. Davies, a kind man who had known my father for years, looking at my empty seat with a flicker of confusion. I pictured my mother placing a hand on his arm and whispering, "She's not well. It's better this way." I saw my brother, Mark, staring at his shoes, his jaw tight with the discomfort of his own betrayal. He would accept his inheritance, his portion of our father's love, without ever acknowledging the sister who was denied even a final goodbye. He would choose peace over principle. And then, the most insidious thought crept in, a whisper that sounded disturbingly like my own voice. Maybe my mother was right. Maybe I was too difficult. Maybe my questions were arguments, my opinions were attacks, and my feelings were theatrics. For a terrifying moment, the foundation of my own identity began to crack. All my life, I had believed I was strong. But what if my strength was just a more destructive form of selfishness? What if, in fighting to be heard, I had just become a source of chaos and pain for the people I loved? The gaslighting had finally seeped into my bones. My mother had spent 2 decades telling me I was the problem, and in the devastating silence of that Friday morning, I finally started to believe her. My grief for my father became tangled with a new, sharper grief for myself. I looked at the worn leather journal on my nightstand, the one my father had given me. For the first time, I felt a hot flush of shame looking at it. It wasn't a symbol of my strength anymore, it was the evidence of my crime. It was the record of my difficult nature. My mother's greatest victory wasn't locking me out, it was making me believe I deserved the key. It wasn't just that she had won the battle, it was that she had convinced me to surrender my sword and agree with her terms. The fight just drained out of me, replaced by a bone-deep, bottomless exhaustion. I felt like a fraud. The daughter my father had loved and encouraged felt like a fictional character I was no longer capable of playing. I got up, took the journal, and tucked it away in the bottom of a drawer, underneath old sweaters. I was hiding the evidence. I was burying the person my father had tried so hard to nurture. There were no more tears left to cry. Crying would mean there was still a fight left in me. All that remained was a hollow cavity in my chest. A void where a daughter used to be. I crawled back to the sofa and pulled a thick blanket over my head, blocking out the light. If the world had decided I didn't deserve a place in it, then maybe it was better to simply disappear. The collapse wasn't loud. It was a quiet, internal crumbling. It was the horrifying moment when I finally, truly, and completely gave up on myself. I lay under that blanket for hours, a self-imposed exile in my own living room. The afternoon light began to fade outside, painting long shadows across the floor. My phone, which had been silent all day, suddenly buzzed on the coffee table. I flinched. It buzzed again. And again. It was a number I didn't recognize. My first thought was that it was my mother, calling from a borrowed phone to deliver another blow, to inform me of what I had missed. I ignored it, letting it go to voicemail. A minute later, a notification popped up. A new message. Curiosity, or perhaps a flicker of self-destructive instinct, made me reach for it. My hands were trembling as I navigated the screen and hit play, holding the phone to my ear. The voice that came through was not my mother's. It was a man's voice, calm, deep, and professional. "Hello, this is a message for Clara Evans. My name is Lawrence Davies, I was your father's attorney and the executor of his estate. I was very sorry you were unable to join us today." I sat up straight, the blanket falling away. "Mr. Davies." His voice was laced with what sounded like genuine concern, not pity. "There are some matters of considerable importance we must discuss. In fact, we were unable to proceed. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." The message ended. I played it again. And a third time. The words echoed in the silent room, dismantling the prison my mother had built around me, brick by brick. "We were unable to proceed. I was sorry you were unable to join us." He had expected me to be there. This wasn't a private affair she had arranged. This was a legal proceeding, and my absence had been a problem. A tiny, fragile seed of doubt about my own worthlessness began to sprout. With shaking fingers, I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Davies speaking." "Hello, Mr. Davies. This is Clara Evans. I got your message," I stammered, my voice rusty from disuse. "Ms. Evans, thank you for returning my call," he said, a note of relief in his voice. "We were all quite concerned when you didn't arrive. Your mother seemed to think you were unwell." He was confirming her lie, but from the other side. The words tumbled out of me before I could stop them, a jumbled mess of apology and confusion. "I'm so sorry, I was told. My mother said that my presence wasn't required. That it was a private family matter and my being there would be difficult." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. A silence so profound I thought he had hung up. When he finally spoke, his professional tone had been replaced by something else. A cold, sharp anger. "Ms. Evans." "Clara," he said, his voice firm. "Let me be perfectly, unequivocally clear. Your presence was not just required, it was the primary stipulation of the entire proceeding. Your father's instructions state, and I quote, 'This reading is not to begin, nor any part of my will be executed, until my daughter, Clara Evans, is present in this room.'" The world stopped spinning. It tilted on its axis and then realigned itself in a completely new way. My father hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't left me to my mother's mercy. He had protected me. He had demanded my presence. Mr. Davies continued, his voice tight with fury on my behalf. "Your mother and brother were informed of this stipulation. We waited for nearly an hour before I was forced to reschedule. Your mother's actions today may have serious legal ramifications." I collapsed back against the sofa, but this time it wasn't in defeat. It was from the sheer, earth-shattering shock of it all. My mother hadn't just barred me. She had defied a legal directive to do it. She hadn't won. She had cheated. And in doing so, she had exposed herself completely. The difficult daughter wasn't me. It was her. The moment the call with Mr. Davies ended, the world came into sharp, brilliant focus. The fog of my self-doubt and grief-induced despair evaporated, burned away by the clean, white-hot fire of the truth. My father hadn't forsaken me. He had fortified me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. My movements were calm and deliberate. I walked to my bedroom, opened the bottom drawer, and took out the leather-bound journal. This time, I didn't feel shame. I felt a profound, overwhelming connection to my dad. His last act on this earth was to ensure my voice was heard. I ran my fingers over the worn cover. My mother had tried to bury me, but she didn't realize my father had planted a seed and left behind the instructions for my growth. The revenge I was about to enact wouldn't be loud or angry. It would be quiet, dignified, and absolute. It would be everything my father would have wanted. Mr. Davies rescheduled the reading for the following Monday. "I will inform your mother and brother of the new, mandatory arrangements," he told me, his voice leaving no room for argument. "All you need to do, Clara, is show up." And I would. The days leading up to it were not filled with anxiety. They were filled with a strange, empowering calm. I wasn't preparing for a family reunion. I was preparing for a coronation. I chose my outfit with care, a simple, well-tailored dress in a shade of charcoal gray. Not the black of a victim, but the color of steel. As expected, my mother called me the next day. The cool, controlled matriarch was gone. In her place was a panicked, cornered animal. "What did you do?" she hissed into the phone, her voice venomous. "What lies did you tell that lawyer?" This was my first taste of real power, and I wielded it with silence. "Hello, Mother," I said, my voice even and calm. "I was simply informed of the rescheduled meeting. I will be there, as per Dad's final wishes." I gave her no emotion, no anger, no satisfaction. Her fury escalated as my calm held steady. "You have no idea what you've done. You've always been a disruptive force in this family." She spat. I replied with a simple, "I'll see you on Monday," and ended the call. Denying her the fight she craved was the cruelest cut of all. When Monday arrived, I felt no fear. I walked into the law firm's pristine lobby, my head held high. The receptionist led me to a conference room. They were already there. My mother, Eleanor, and my brother, Mark, sitting on one side of a large mahogany table. My mother's face was a mask of cold fury. Mark looked pale and sick, staring at a fixed point on the wall, unable to meet my eyes. The empty chair wasn't mine anymore. It was a throne, waiting for its queen. Mr. Davies stood as I entered, a warm, respectful smile on his face. "Clara, thank you for coming," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Please, have a seat. We can now begin." He gestured to the chair at the head of the table, directly opposite him. The placement was intentional. It positioned me not as a child, but as an equal to the executor. My mother's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She and Mark were relegated to the side, like secondary players. I took my seat, placing my purse calmly on the table. I didn't look at them. My focus was entirely on Mr. Davies. I was not there for them. I was there for my father. My polite, unwavering focus on the lawyer rendered them invisible. The revenge was not in a single, vindictive act. It was in my very presence. It was in my composure. It was in the shattering of the narrative she had so carefully constructed. I was not the difficult, hysterical daughter. I was the honored guest, the key to the entire proceeding. The air in the room was thick with unspoken rage and humiliation, none of it mine. For the first time in my life, I was the one in control. And all I had to do was sit there, in the silence, and wait for my father's words to do the talking. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the thick, hostile silence. He put on a pair of reading glasses, opened the large, leather-bound folder before him, and looked pointedly at me. As per Richard's explicit instructions, he began, "This document is to be read in its entirety, without interruption." His eyes briefly flickered towards my mother, a silent warning. Eleanor sat ramrod straight, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. The air crackled with her suppressed rage. She believed this was a mere formality before her reign was solidified. She was wrong. I, Richard Evans, Mr. Davies began to read, his voice filling the room, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. He paused, turning a page. Before any division of assets, property, or accounts, it is my final and most urgent wish to address my daughter, Clara Evans, first. My name. He spoke my name first. Not my mother's, the grieving widow of 40 years. Mine. I felt a sharp, collective intake of breath from the other side of the table. My mother's head snapped towards Mr. Davies, her eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time in my life, I saw her composure completely shatter. Mr. Davies continued, now reading from a handwritten letter my father had appended to the will. "To my dearest Clara," he read, and my father's voice seemed to echo in the words. "If you are hearing this, it means I failed you in life. I failed to be strong enough to protect you from the smallness of others, and for that, I am eternally sorry." Tears welled in my eyes, hot and fast. These were not tears of sadness, but of profound, earth-shattering validation. He had seen it all. He had understood. "Your mother called you difficult," the letter went on. "I called you brilliant. Your strength, your fire, your refusal to be silenced, that was never your flaw, Clara. It was, and is, your greatest gift. It is the best part of me. It is my true legacy." My mother made a small, strangled sound. Mark sank lower in his chair, as if trying to physically disappear. The letter was a posthumous rebellion, a final, loving act of defiance against his wife's tyranny. He was speaking directly to me, across time and death, and he was setting me free. The will then directed Mr. Davies to a small, sealed box on the table. "This box and its entire contents are to be given to my daughter, Clara, and they are hers alone, separate from any marital assets," he read. He pushed the polished wooden box across the table to me. Inside was a key to a private safe deposit box. Beside it was my father's treasured first edition copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Tucked within its pages was a final, small note. "Keep fighting the good fight," it said. "I hope you filled that journal. I am so proud of you." The symbolic objects of my life, the book, the journal, my difficult thoughts, were not my burdens, they were my inheritance. The rest of the will was simple. The marital assets were divided conventionally, as required by law. But it didn't matter. The financial distribution was a footnote. The real inheritance had already been given. My father had given me back my own story. My mother spent my life trying to write me out of the story. My father gave me the pen to write the ending. That was the thought that solidified in my mind as Mr. Davies finished reading. I stood up, my movements calm. I took the box, my inheritance, my vindication. I gave a single, respectful nod to Mr. Davies, a gesture of gratitude. I did not look at my mother or my brother. They no longer existed in my world. I turned and walked out of the conference room without a word, leaving them to sit in the ruins of the kingdom my mother had tried to build on lies. I didn't look back. The automatic glass doors of the law firm slid open, and I stepped out into the brilliant, blinding afternoon sun. For the first time, it didn't hurt my eyes. It felt like a welcome. It felt like the first day of my new life.